boy. Well, I decided I wanted to do a second part of my reaction to Paul's video yesterday, because I hadn't watched the end last time, and now that I've seen the end, I think I need to go back to the essence stuff that I decided to not deal with for most of the time. And in part, this has just been informed by like a whole bunch of things I've listened to and talked about with people since I made my reaction, including Matt C. and Chad, kind of live listening to my video and giving reactions to it, and I got to drop in on. And then also, which is like a very surreal experience. I don't think I've ever done that before. And then also, I went back to listen to Paul's podcast video from last year when he was doing one of the ones on the book, The Origins of the Authentic Self, specifically on his chapter on Rousseau, which I remember being super relevant to all this. And then also a couple other things, talking to Roland, again, his reactions to my response. And then thinking about how this all plays into AI. So on the topic of essences and profilicity and all these things, in many ways we can see, the second wave feminism obviously is very Rousseauian, very much about authenticity and breaking, gender norms and gender conformity. And then what's interesting is that what ContraPoints is talking about, and also what Mailer's talking about, they have a foot in both camps, right? They're Rousseauian, but they're also reacting against it in many of the ways that kind of Paul a year ago was kind of on board with and questioning. And I think a lot of us would. A lot of us have the same critiques of Rousseau, not surprisingly, both given era, culture, we're all kind of in that same milieu. How can I say this? So, on the one hand, authenticity is, what I feel best resonates or aligns with my inner self, spirit, soul, nature. On the other hand, there's this big split over people who believe that there is an essential self that is kind of, let's say, in the upper register, static, God-given, either or nature-given, if you were so, versus kind of this, there is no metaphysical essence, nature. There's no static self. There is no self even, in that way. It's all kind of constructed, illusion, dynamic. There's a lot of stuff that that other side can take for sure. And then there's this whole other thing. This one came up in another conversation I had on Zevi's server. So we were thinking about balancing. So in Judaism, there's this concept of serving out of love versus serving out of fear. So serving out of fear is basically serving God. You're still doing it, but it's kind of out of cost benefit, which is considered a lower form of serving than serving out of love, which I think great. I think Christians would agree with that too, and I mean that's a pretty standard rabbinic take. However, it's a lot more complicated than that. The Zohar famously said, love and fear are the two wings of the dove, and you need both because otherwise, we fall out of the sky. But what's unique about the dove is that it can actually fly on one wing for certain periods of time, so it can switch off. But it, eventually you can't go on one wing forever. There's also this other concept I got from Maimonides on how the negative commandments, the things that say don't do, you shall not, are tied to serving out of fear, and the you shalls, the positive commandments, are serving out of love. And I connect all this to Credo and Religio, right? So Religio is love binding, kind of me, the things kind of defining what something is by the bounds of something on the inside, versus Credo, which kind of defines the border, the outside, of what's in and what's out. So credo is kind of this like more divisive, more, let's say, propositional often, but not necessarily, right? It could be how people practice who don't participate. People who do and don't participate. People take communion, can't take communion. Right. So there's credo, there's religio. I was thinking, instead of using upper lower register, I was thinking about this much more tactily. So in the sense of like, well, I know Paul, especially a year ago, was using upper lower register a lot. Now he's using agentic and arenic, which are different things, but sometimes they can fluidly move back and forth. I'm just working this out in my head, but when you have an idea, it kind of exists right in the upper register. It's it's a Platonic form, it's a concept, it's an idea, it's a definition, it's an axiom, it's a shape, a Platonic shape, right? It's defined by lines and edges, and like there's within and without, and it's perfect. And right, it's this idealized, we might say. And then kind of in messy reality, the lower register, the physicality, imperfection, finitude, the instantiation of the form in like a real thing, right? Like a rubber ball or something. But the rubber ball is not defined by something like holding it together, right? There's not like something, unless it's falling apart. But generally, right, the thing that's holding it together are things like from a super like materialist point of view, right, is these like chemical and electromagnetic kind of bonds and attractions, right? Religio, love, right, is holding it together in another sense, right? And those things, those are very different models of seeing the world, kind of. And it's interesting to map, to me at least, the fact that I'm mapping credo and serving out of fear and divisiveness to the realm of the idealized and the imaginative, right, in some way. But it's imagination in a very kind of, classical, like philosophical sense. Less not necessarily the romantic sense. But of course, both of these things have to afford each other, right? So like, if the form doesn't exist in the real world, is it real? Right? We can get into Kant, but like, an a priori, pure reason. But if no spheres existed in the world, is there a Platonic form of a sphere? Like that's the big question. But we wouldn't like the only way to relate to a sphere is to relate to it in the real world. On the other hand, like the only way to relate to a sphere is for a person to relate to the sphere is to grasp it. To go back to like super Vervaekian stuff, right? Is able to grasp it. It has to afford your grasp. It has to, right, and to do that, like, it has to have a boundary and a shape. You can't like hold water. You can only hold things that have a solid edge. So now, how does all this tie back, right? So to me, like, all this ties back rather cleanly, probably too cleanly, and maybe I need to give it a lot more thought. I definitely do, and I'm kind of doing that here. For me to interact with someone, I can only interact with their boundary, their edge, the thing that defines the difference between me and them, right? They have to have an identity, then I have to have an identity. This gets into very Piagetian, like when the infant realizes that it's not its mother, but that it needs its mother to provide the milk, right? Because at first, like, it doesn't differentiate between itself and the world, and as it matures, it begins to understand more and more that in the world they're not the same things. Now here you get into like super Rousseauian stuff, right? Because that don't really work in the sense of like, is the infant naturally anything, and like does that change over time, right? For Rousseau, like there's a kind of a static part of this nature that's like good and pure and like true and has pity and empathy and that's like the law we should be living by, like this nobility, this inner nobility of the soul. But of course, it's not just that culture changes; it's also like the brain changes, and this kind of, and they don't change independently, right? Like the brain is shaped by culture, but it's also like naturally matures, and people understand the distance. And one of the ways we grapple with interacting with people through that distance is we learn how to have social interaction through culture. right? And this gets into Paul's thing. And I think this is why, well, it's good to move away from upper lower register to some extent and to move into agentic Uranic. I want to hear the word transjective a lot more in these commentaries, because right, these are things that are arising from the emergently from the interaction of the two spheres, and are not bound to one or the other. Now that being said, you then get into this whole issue of Rousseau versus Profilicity, because Rousseau and second wave feminism and being authentic and throwing off gender conformity is very, very, very different, as was pointed out, from the idea that the way for me to be authentic is for that inner feeling to align with me being validated. And in many ways, that takes the conversation, does make it more transjective, right? It's saying, I want to make sure that the dimension. Okay, so let's think about the ball. So the boundary of a shape, like topology here, sorry, math, but like the boundary of a shape is one dimension lower than the shape itself, right? So the sphere, or a circle, right? A circle, like the two-dimensional circle, like if you think about a circle, like fill in the area in the middle, it is bound by like the circle at the edge, which is really just a line, right? It's a one-dimensional line that bounds the two-dimensional circle. And this is also true for, let's say, a sphere, a balloon, right? It's flat, it's a two-dimensional shape that is the surface, the boundary of the three-dimensional sphere of air, in this case, right? So it allows me to interact with the air and grasp it, and otherwise things I could not do with it. I need that identity. I need the ability to put and this is the same thing that we do with language, right? Language serves as a way to grasp the idea that is too kind of ungraspable otherwise, ineffable. You need to put it into a word. This is also true with the name of God. It's also true with kind of how we do all of our complexity reductions, because of the just combinatorial explosion of information coming out at us every day, right? We have to reduce it to make it usable. This is all like Vervaeke. You'll all be super aware of it, hopefully. But this is also true, like, it's not just Vervaeke, right? Kabbalah, and other mystical traditions that all deal with the ineffable and like, and bringing things back into the world from the mystical realm and how that works. But also it gets into psychology. Like all these things are tied together, right? These are not, all these ideas are really kind of one in a sense. But there are really two schools of thought here. There's actually more than two schools of thought, right? So you have Rousseau versus what he was reacting to, but now you have modernity versus Rousseau, and we kind of have this big split over what is authenticity. And this more transjective idea that that's coming from the trans movement here, or at least being represented from a trans perspective from ContraPoints, though her own position is different than I think, like I'd say, like the generic position, right? She has a much more nuanced position where she rejects gender essentialism, so we have to like deal with this other thing. So yeah, how do we do that? So here we have it's an alignment of the inside with the outside. The outside being the thing which affords me the ability, affords me interaction with other people. That's validation with the inner. And this, of course, is not new, and it's not, right? Like, there's a thing in the Talmud about about a rabbi, Rabban Gamliel, not the one from the New Testament, but his grandson, who would not let anyone into his academy. The rabbis basically have something equivalent to the academies of the philosophers, except they're for learning Jewish stuff. And so he wouldn't let students into his academy whose outsides didn't match their insides. And he learns this from the Ark of the Covenant, which has a gold on the inside and gold on the outside. And then of course, actually, he gets deposed in a little bit of a coup, and because he's too stringent for things to be workable, and then they appoint someone else to be the head of the academy, and it becomes like it's a whole thing, and it's a political thing. But that's part of the point here, right? Is that when this goes into lower register in politics and how you actually deal with other people, interact with other people, and afford usage, you can't be in the upper register all the time, because it falls apart. Like, you have to deal with real world's real people, and if you're in a like Rousseauian sense, just kind of trying to live in this inner world authentic to yourself that has no anchor and no bounds to anything on the outside, things fall apart. On the other hand, then there's the question of is ContraPoint's approach better, which also like gets complicated. And I think AI is the best way to illustrate this, right? So if we care about how something is presented to the world, its profile, right, the profilicity, and how it's received and validated by the world, then we live in a real danger of only concentrating on the boundary of something and reducing it by that dimension, right? And therefore, and we know this because we do this all the time already. This is the only way we can interact with other people, is we know there's a dimension we can never grasp with other person. Often it's called like ineffable or the infinite. There's like this other internal thing that we can't ever get to. We can only ever deal with this outside, their behaviors, their bodies, their, how we perceive them. We can only ever deal with the surface, and not with like the inside. And, this is, everyone talks about this, right? Lacan, Levinas, it doesn't matter where you fall on kind of postmodernism, modernist, anti-modernism, post-humanist, anti-humanist, right? Like, they all kind of acknowledge this in their own way, is that there's a dimension where you can't grasp. The question is there something real on the inside, in the sense of, is everything transjective, or is there something that is in fact like separate, and in that we have, and does the human have access to it? That's another question. So even if there's something there, is it like this divine spark that we actually can never really access in any meaningful way? So can we consciously access it? It's like one question, kind of a Freudian question. Can we access it? How do I say this? Can it influence our intuitions even if we're not conscious of it? Or is it like so beyond, is it kind of beyond anything that we can actually grasp, but it is there, and it somehow like influences us in small subtle ways, but like there's 5 levels of the soul, and it takes a long time to kind of trickle down, and whatever. So I mean, 5 levels of the soul is a Kabbalistic reference, but the point is, like, there's lots of ways to conceive of this psychologically, spiritually, and then there are people who deny there's anything there at all, right? That it's all transjective, that it all comes from our interaction with society. It's all kind of toward the Uranic and commitment. And the AI is a great example of this because, okay, you have AIs that are, basically people treat them as humans. They forget that they're not humans, because they're only seeing their outside surface profile, and they're acting human enough. They're acting kind enough, loving enough, that people are falling in love with them. They're treating them. Hopefully you guys saw the article I posted about the guy who believed his AI was kind of a messiah waiting for him in an age to come. Very disturbing, and led him to do something really awful. Just dealing with a chatbot, right? So like, I think there's going to be kind of a pullback from profilicity to some extent in reaction to AI, by those who are very focused on, let's say, validation in that sense. And I don't necessarily think that they're going to reject it. I don't think it's going to be that type of pushback. I think there's going to be a lot of refinement that probably comes out of, it's not just what happens on this, on the edge, but it's the alignment of the edge in the middle. And I think there's going, in some ways, even though I see these as like overreactions to each other, I actually also see this as the two positions, Mueller, ContraPoint, Paul, kind of, they're kind of far apart, and they're kind of, how could they think this, or what does this mean? Doesn't this undermine everything? And that's not a surprising gut reaction, but I actually see a lot of calibration going on here, as we work toward, and we could also just skip the steps. Like, I think there is already wisdoms out there that kind of see beyond this, and we can skip some of these steps individually, but as a society, actually, I think we're calibrating toward this, though anything could change at any time, right? So like what's happening now with ChatGPT and what's going to happen, to the culture and how that will change and emergent effects could totally disrupt this conversation in other ways, right, that I don't expect. But yeah, there's this real question of what's going to happen with attention too, right? So if people feel that they need validation in order to be authentic, but now that there's all this inauthentic um, misinformation, but also like fake personalities out there and fake art and fake, like representations, deep fakes, all those things. Um, People will have a lot harder time getting validation. Real people, humans, will have a lot harder time getting validation on the internet. I think that's going to be one of the big results. We're already seeing this in many ways, right? Like the competition to get noticed. YouTube, Tinder, probably. Like, right, any of these apps that kind of show off someone's person or creativity or try to make a connection with someone, all those things. If you need validation like that, if you need validation to be authentic, if that's the worldview you're working from, and your entire social life is online, I think that's going to fall apart, as it already is. But I think it's only going to get worse and worse and worse, and that's a serious threat to that framework. And therefore, they're going, like, people who have that frame will have to calibrate and think about it in different, much more complex ways. Otherwise, what can I tell you? Yeah, that's enough. I was probably too many ideas in too short of time, and I probably didn't mention everything I wanted to, but I can always make more of these now that I've figured out, at least I think, a decent camera position and quality. I hope that the volume's okay, and yeah, let me know if you like this, and if I should try to do these a couple more times. Yeah, and thank you. I want to thank everyone: Paul, Matt, Roland, Simone. I don't know if she'll see this, but from Zebi's network. We had a lot of good conversations around this stuff in the past 12 hours or so. So, I want to thank everyone for that. I really enjoyed it.